Trying to stay somewhat topical, I thought I would make a video regarding the top 10 books which I read during the duration of 2022. The books are in no particularly ranked listing, but if I had to recommend only one of the books, I will let it be the last book I mention on this list. I have also left a link in the description for my Goodreads account, so if you are really curious, you can satisfy your curiosity by checking out other books I read as well. Now, before we start, I wouldn't be me if I didn't also start off the presentation with a warning of sorts in terms of the idealization of books, which can become a familiar trapping for some, including me in the past, to fall down into. First of all, it's not always obvious that reading a book on a subject matter is always the best path to follow when delving into the depth of some subject or interest. One can imagine, for instance, a scenario where a person specializing in the history of Vikings, for instance, who has already read, let's say, 25 books on the subject matter in the past and is eagerly anticipating a new history book on the Vikings. Now, it will very much be the case that this new book contains some new novel information on the Vikings, perhaps related to some new archaeological finding. But now consider the following dilemma. In order to absorb this new novel information, or we imagine this Viking book is of considerable length, as well as being intended for the general slash moderately specialized audience, you are going to have to dig through at least, let's say, 80 to 85% of material for which you are already familiar with. It just seems reasonable in this situation that it's far more productive to do a quick Google Scholar search relating to this newest finding and skim through some results until you find a study with the relevant information. This study will certainly be bound to be a fraction of the length, and with the added bonus that if you are used to reading studies, you will be able to find such novel information much quicker. Other common trappings include not absorbing the material in the book in a deep fashion as you are eager to get to the next book, or picking up a book that is way beyond your scope of understanding, in which it would have been easier to cover the preliminary steps in a more introductory book at first before moving on. There are other poor practices one could mention, such as picking up book after book containing the same information, as is sadly very often the case with productivity books, where one gets the feeling that after reading 10 such books, one has in fact been reading the same book 10 times. But I find that a strong root of commonality with all these assorted book pains lies at the heart in the idealization of books that exists in our culture. That is, one becomes submerged in the attraction and allure that books have represented historically, and one lingers for the same intellectual attainment and to be seen in the same milieu as one's distorted perception of previous great figures. All this is just to say that be happy if you picked up a book, if you like reading, but it may also be healthy to examine your own reading practices while at the same time keeping a critical eye. Now, let's delve into some books. The first book I want to talk about is the famed history book, A Study in History, Volumes 7 to 10, by Arnold Toynbee, where this book compromises the second half abridgment of the original 12-volume series detailing universally history. To be precise, this abridgment here was edited by Somervell and was released prior to the publications of books 11 and 12 in this series. Thus, the abridgment works in effect as a summation of the first books comprising the series. In any case, perhaps due to the length constrictions of the original series, which spans roughly 7,000 pages, the abridgment of the series has really been the dominant form these books take, and which people most often read. It also often frequents lists pertaining to the best history books ever written, which I admit was the original motivation as to why I decided to read the abridgment books. I guess what's of particular interest to me is the ambitious perspective Toynbee takes with these books, where he wants essentially to place himself as that of a scientist with a magnifying glass overlooking the world's civilizations, which he divides into 5 living, 16 extinct, along with several others which he defines as arrested civilizations, with the aim of determining commonalities in terms of genesis, growth, and the eventual decay which all civilizations will eventually encounter. I see therefore in his work a leniency on an ambition to comprise civilizations in terms of a scientific endeavor, where Toynbee wants to hand his readers the key in terms of his working model, which will determine the rise and fall of civilizations according to reoccurring patterns. I won't go into more specifics on this model here, but I will briefly mention among others, his emphasis placed upon the genesis event of civilization being tied with that of adaptations to arising difficult circumstances, and the decay of civilizations being aligned with that of a creative minority on the inside of civilization known as the internal proletariat, which exists in an antagonizing relationship with that of the external proletariat, which is located beyond the frontiers of the civilization in question. In all, I would recommend this book, as if you are interested in history, as the overarching vantage point is so different than what is found in the specialization corridors that currently comprise modern historical research. Although that being said, I can see why historical research developed in the way it did. In any case, this book is certainly a nice contrast to the more specialist approach, and also in many ways mimics the earlier project taken on by Spengler in his seminal work, The Decline of the West. The second book I want to mention is a book I accidentally picked up at a used bookstore called Better Together: Restoring the American Community by Robert Putnam and Louis Feldstein, which details the disintegration of social structures found in American landscapes, that is, the United States, where the author's remedy and main argument is to act in terms of social activism as well as that of community renewal. This ties together both an enactment of social change based upon majority based movements with the goal of seeking political process participation to achieve change, as well as that of enabling people to improve their lives through a greater sense of social cohesion. Although I felt the book was severely lacking in empirical research merit, choosing instead to focus upon singular examples and stories whereby the temptation to cast a vast generalization always becomes a considerable danger, I nonetheless found the accounts given to be both inspiring, and of course I very much agree with the sentiments given by the authors in terms of increasing both civic awareness as well as encouraging more civic associations. The authors reiterate, for example, the term social capital as used by social scientists to refer to social networks, norms of reciprocity, mutual assistance, and trustworthiness, which I agree are all aspiring activities and behaviors which, when aligned with the ever increasing automation features and technological social disconnectedness found within our society, can help to reverse trends, as most recently seen in the pandemic of loneliness, which occurred following the virus outbreak of 2019. In all, I would recommend the book as I believe social capital is very important both for mental well being as well as for civic participation within society, although readers beware that some of the examples given are quite dated nowadays. Number 3 on the list is the book Democracy: A Life by Paul Cartledge, which details the early democratic developments of ancient Greece, as well as very briefly examining more recent introductions to the development of democracy. It's important to note here that although the distinction would not have been made at the time when we are talking about democratic developments in ancient Greece, we are referring to that of direct democracy where people decide on policy in a direct manner without the need of elected representative, which is again contrasted with that of representative democracy. I have to admit that I have been reading quite a few books recently concerning ancient Greek history, as I want to make a dedicated historical series on ancient Greece, which I will start working on in the coming year. This book also serves in conjunction with my interest in relation with that of both direct democracy and anarchism, which I briefly touched upon in my previous introduction to anarchism video. Of course, it's important not to idealize this democratic history of Greece, as among others, both women and slaves were excluded from the democratic process, as well as the implementation varied greatly between differing centuries. Also, let's remember that oligarchy and aristocratic means of rules existed through longer spans of history than that of the most developed form of democratic life seen in ancient Greece. In total, I guess what I learned most from this book is the emphasis placed on the differing degrees and adoption of democracy, where even inside Athens, which in many ways had the most developed form of democracy, there existed varying degrees and regional differences of democracy. This is a distinction which is also drawn in Aristotle's book Politics, in which he divides democracy in a normative fashion into four subspecies of radicality, choosing himself the middle degree of democracy, which is very much in keeping with his own philosophy in regards to adopting the middle way, in this case in terms of collective judgment of the Athenian polis. I mention also here that the notion of a polis is hard to define, but perhaps the easiest classification, in which I won't give more details here, is that of a Greek version of a city-state. To conclude then, I would certainly recommend the book to anyone remotely interested in politics and the development of democracy as an introduction. The only downfall I had with this book is that it throws in democratic developments from the 16th century onward to present day in like 3 chapters, and I have no idea why. If he wanted to include these developments, he should have written a considerably longer book, in my opinion. But also, as the main emphasis is on the Greek democratic developments, I'm not sure that the author even needed to include it at all in the book. Number 4 is the only novel I included on the list, unfortunately, which is that of Frank Herbert's Children of Dune, the third entry in the Dune franchise. Having read the first book many times throughout the years, I at least want to read the first 6 novels in the franchise, and perhaps even more, as I adore this particular universe along with both the Star Trek and Alien franchises. Children of Dune, in many ways, marks a return, and in my opinion even surmounts the grandiose and epic storytelling found within the first Dune book. This is in contrast to the previous book of Dune Messiah, which works more as a long epilogue to the first book, or perhaps I might be persuaded on a second read that it works more as an introduction to the lavish world which comprises Children of Dune. Anyhow, we in this book follow the twin children of Paul Atreides, the famed main character of the first entry in the franchise, as they navigate both the rich tapestry of politics found within the universe, involving much potential for political entrappings, as well as witnessing the further developments of the planet they inhabit. This will lead eventually to the terraforming of the planet Arrakis, known informally as Dune, where if this process is successful, it will kill off all the sandworms. Then one may ask what will happen to the most sought out of spices, namely that of the melange. I have to admit upon completion that Children of Dune is my favorite read in the franchise so far, and in my opinion should be regarded as a seminal work of science fiction, holding the same status as that of the original Dune book. I won't delve more into the thematics in this video, but I will briefly mention that I don't adhere to a more classical interpretation that the Dune universe exists as the other end of a bifurcation event, which has seen it going down a path of a futuristic feudal society rather than that of a highly technological society more traditionally aligned with that seen in the genre of hard science fiction. Instead, I claim that Dune has successfully intertwined the feudal with that of the post-technological, where upon surface inspection, yes, they have banned computers and AI, but the emphasis has merely been reshifted to that of enhancement of the human condition, very much in line with some technological thinking today taking the form of transhumanism. Oh, also as a side note, I've recently started reading the fourth book in the franchise, and I found a little bit of a decline in the writing style compared to the first 3 books. I'm wondering if other people have felt the same way. But let's conclude then and say that if you enjoy science fiction and have a pulse, then you have to read the Dune books. It's merely obligatory, in my opinion. Number 5 on the list is the landmark book Orientalism, written by Edward Said, which addresses both the usage as well as the rich discourse surrounding the term Orientalism, which has been historically tied to that of a depiction of the Eastern world or the Orient, here taken to comprise the Middle East, Asia, and the Far Eastern territories. For Said, then, the term works concretely as the West's manifestation of discourses and doctrines concerning the Orient, but more generally, we may see Said as making a comment on the construction of Orientalism as that of a Western fantasy, where emphasis is removed from real existing empirical observations to that of fantasies and dreams with their built in assumptions. This in turn helps to relegate the position of the society and its peoples, where through a fabricated construct, often placing emphasis on loose societal descriptions, such as that of the exotic, sensual, or being fickle, ill-advised doctrines and suppressive measures become more prominent, as seen by the British Empire as an example. The harm is thus in many ways that these notions remain constant over time, which includes harmful, static views such as that of cultural and scientific progress being inherently tied to that of the West, which in turn allows us to view the term Orientalism as that of an institution which permeates through structural institutions over time, exerting its influence over domains such as that as the educational and the justice system. It's important to point out here, as the author does, that not all academics and people for that matter studying the Orient were inherently racist in their approach to the study of the Orient, but rather would nonetheless, perhaps through cultural biases, choose to wrongfully extrapolate from ancient sources to the current population rather than conduct a scholarly research derived from independent population sample sizes, as an example, in order to map out the great variance in societal behavior seen in the Eastern world. I did very much enjoy reading the book, and I'm glad for the effect it has had in various academic disciplines. If I were to provide a critique, it would be as that of forgetting to place enough weight on the historical resistance by the colonized as well as exploring the resistance found within the West itself. Although not detailed in the book, I would, from an artistic view, also defend many of the particular paintings which were made at the time, which, although in certain aspects do play into the superficial stereotypes concerning the Orient, also warrant an artistic consideration removed from that of the ideological in terms of maintaining a healthy art critique practice, as well as that of art enjoyment for that sake. For number 6, I first thought about featuring Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy, but seeing as I have neither read Bertrand Russell's or Anthony Kenny's books on the history of philosophy, I want to suspend judgment on this book until I have read the other famous accounts to see how well it holds up, and if I prefer another single volume relating the history of philosophy. I have instead therefore placed here the book Men of Mathematics by E.T. Bell, which is somewhat of a classic when it comes to mathematical history/biography accounts. I also like how this book serves as a nice contrast to when working with mathematics, which is really more of an activity above all else, and where you can easily spend an hour or two on a single page of a mathematical textbook. This book lets you instead relax a little, as it were, in the sense as it is not quite as dense. The best feature, however, of the book is that it is both well written as well as that it personalizes the history of mathematics, where you not only get an insight to famous mathematicians' result, but you also get an account of their life and journey situated in a historical context. As there is relatively sparse mathematics in the book, it's also a welcome addition for those who don't have a particularly strong interest in the subject or want to get a glimpse at some underlying mathematical beauty from a historical perspective. It should be said, however, that the book concerns itself with mathematics from a very Western perspective, as is inherent from the start, and I suspect the author was also most familiar with this approach at the time of writing this book. If you do study more upon mathematics, however, and its rich history, it's of course a very global phenomena, having its formalized abstract origins, I would say, nonetheless found in that of ancient Greek mathematics. In keeping with a mathematical theme, number 7 is the very short book Calculus Better Explained by Khalil Azard, which I wish I had read when I was taking all my calculus classes, as it provides a both poignant and brilliant intuition behind common concepts, such as derivatives and integrals found within any calculus course. More than anything, it highlights the creative endeavor which comprises that of mathematics, where a plurality of approaches is highly sought after, and where one so often finds connection between differing fields, such as that is between geometry and calculus, which are so very well highlighted in this book. Retracing the footsteps of Archimedes, who can be seen as a direct predecessor in terms of calculus, I felt that I was being led through both a mathematical path where plain language was emphasized over rote memorization and formulas, and highly constructive analogies were being presented, building on my geometric intuition along the way. I would recommend this especially for the interested high school student, or alternatively for a first year college student taking calculus perhaps. In addition, I would also check out the author's webpage, which has been of tremendous help along the years for myself, as an example. Number 8 might be seen as controversial for some, where I have placed the book Gospel Fictions by Randall Helms, where perhaps what is gained from the increased marketability due to the provocative title also has its downsides, in that it is likely to dissuade Christian readers from picking it up, which I feel is a shame, since it also is of great aid in terms of detailing the basic tenets and historical facts which relate to that of the New Testament. The main thesis is, however, put forth already in the first chapter of the book, where Helms posits that the Gospels may be seen from the vantage point as great works of art containing narratives produced by highly sought after literary artists, putting forth a theological vision, as he puts it, where obviously much of the material, such as the performing of miracles, will also borrow heavily from that of past religious oral traditions. There is even a synthesis in some sense between that of the Old and New Testament, where we, for example, find a strong connection between the vision of Ezekiel in the Old Testament with that of Peter's vision in the New Testament. What I found to be some of the most interesting portions of the book, however, was that relating how the same narrative contained within one gospel could be changed by another, which very much brings into question the reliableness of these texts, which have been estimated to be written 40 years after the death of Jesus, where the so called original disciple authors would already have been of considerable advanced age. This taken in conjunction with the fact that the New Testament was written in Greek and not in Hebrew, where we are to assume, for example, that Peter, being a fisherman, would have no trouble in being in command of written Greek. In terms of discrepancies in narrative accounts, one could mention here as an example the differing accounts concerning what immediately followed after the tomb disappearance of Jesus. But my favorite relates the apprehension of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where we in the Gospel of Mark are told, following the event of one of the bystanders cuts off the ear of the high priest's servants, Jesus relays the following message: Do you take me for a bandit, that you have come out with swords and cudgels to arrest me? Here, Jesus berates essentially the people arresting him, but puzzling enough, does not give effort into intervening the person whose ear has just been cut off. He also makes a remark about the lack of necessity of arresting him, as his whereabouts were common knowledge, or as he puts it, day after day I was within your reach, as I taught in the temple, and you did not lay your hands on me. We can here contrast this above narration with the narration given in the Gospel of Luke, where of course Jesus intervenes and magically heals the ear, and we are even given an account as to which ear was cut off. It is as if the second story, I find, which many others also have noted, serves as an improvement of the first narration found in Mark, where limitations regarding Jesus' divine power are no longer removed, and keeping in tradition with the total omission of sin regarding Jesus' own life, the intervention serves in some sense as reinforcing that of divine characteristics. In total, then, I found the book as containing that of a highly interesting nature, where it tries to excavate the sources and origin stories contained within the New Testament on one hand, and brings into question the authenticity of the texts taken as a whole with the other. There are some parts which I found merit more nuance as to the author's certainty of pinpointing exactly which earlier religious oral traditions are being borrowed from, but in totality, I found the book to be very enjoyable and I recommend it to anyone interested in religion and that of its development. Number 9 returns us to the domain of mathematics again with the book Philosophy of Mathematics by Øystein Lindboe, which examines philosophical issues within mathematics, which has traditionally been indebted much to the work done in the 19th century, as well as that of early 20th century, with the works among others such as Poincaré, Cantor, Russell, Frege, and Hilbert. Prior to this, we do not find a more formalized, systematic discussion pertaining to the philosophy of mathematics, and there certainly was a long period in time where, for most mathematicians, mathematics was viewed as having a fully worked out, undisputed foundation, not subject to change. Skip to present day, where we find views such as viewing mathematics as nothing more than that of a collection of syntactical games under the heading of game formalism, and we have, thanks to Frege's theorem, room for completely conceptually different axiomatizations, which is just a glimpse of the diversity currently comprising that of the modern incarnation of mathematics. For me personally, then, I guess this relays a nice branch of interest for me, having viewed mathematics in the past in a much cleaner and duller structural way, and perhaps in a too idealized Platonic fashion. I also find that philosophy of mathematics, along with philosophy of science, are the two subsets of philosophy which I currently enjoy the most, and this book certainly goes a long way into giving me a satisfying introduction to the field, where both historically prescient topics as well as that of more contemporary issues in philosophy of mathematics are discussed, including topics such as the axiom of choice, which also working research mathematicians have to consider from time to time. Although, as I note, I have the general feeling that philosophers are much more interested in philosophy behind mathematics than that of working mathematicians. Finally, we reach the 10th final book in the list. But before we do, I would like to make an honorable mention with that of the graphic novel The Inkle, written by Jodorowsky, with art from French comic book master Moebius, which did not make it to the list as I was pedantic enough this time to only consider books. Anyway, The Inkle, with its unconventional storytelling and thematic emphasis concerning a search for neo-spiritual meaning in a futuristic, droid-centric landscape of the Baroque placed around a powerful artifact and a disheveled future noir detective, make for a very strong recommendation coming from me. The final book which I have put on the list is the book Calling Bullshit by Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West. And living up to its refreshing title, the book advocates for both more skepticism as well as more critical thinking in an increasingly technological and data driven world. In a world where unsubstantiated claims have sadly become the norm, very much embodying the ever increasing tendency of merely putting out content in order to generate income, and where political aims are no longer assessed on their merit, but on their ability to simply win strategic battles and arguments, there is a real thirst for countering content such as that contained within this book. I don't know if it is the pessimist in me being manipulated to hope for other outcomes, or my deeply felt positive reaction when reading this book that put this as the number one for me last year. But I do know that there are many valuable lessons to take away from the book. To give a list of some of the more pertinent ones, I will name: Number 1. When a claim is too good to be true, be skeptical. Number 2. It's much easier to generate bullshit than it is to counter it, where bullshit here is taken to mean committing a violation of the conversational framework with the aim of getting others to believe you are concerned with the truth of a matter when you are in fact not. Number 3. Bullshit spreads faster and requires less intelligence than efforts to counter it. Number 4. When countering bad claims, don't introduce an array of unnecessary terminology. Try to give simple explanations and try to come up with alternative explanations, which may explain events and knowledge gaps better than the alternative bad claims, including wild conspiracies. Number 5. Don't get hung up on small pedantic details like the well actually guy does. Calling bullshit and debunking claims is not about signaling your own intelligence, where the well actually guy can actually divert the conversation in such a manner which is more in common with bullshit than you might think at first hand. Number 6. Be open to accept the case that you might be wrong, and don't impute malice when incompetence is a sufficient explanation. That sums up the video, which was a bit longer than I originally intended it to be, but I hope some of the recommendations were at the very least helpful. Even if it did not get you to want to read any of the books I recommended, I hope my reflections were at the very least somewhat cogent and insightful. Also, if there is a particular book you want to suggest, you can leave a comment below the video.